The faces of 4 U.S. presidents from a granite mountain in Black Hills, South Dakota. For some, Mount Rushmore is venerated as the sacred place of democracy. For Indian Americans, the monument is often considered a sacred site of illegal occupation. While Mount Rushmore is a tourist destination that attracts about 3 million visitors a year, it is also home to many Indian American protests and occupations. One of the most notable events of the 20th century occurred in the 1970s and 1971s, when Native American activists climbed up and captured Mount Rushmore to protest theft and pollution of sacred sites. Under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, the Shoshone, Salish, Kootenai Crow, Mandan, Arikara, and Lakota people lived in the Negro region, a shelter that the Lakota call the center of all that exists. A long time, Gerald Baker, a Mandan Hidatsa Indian who served as a pastor at Mount Rushmore National Monument from 2004 to 2010, says Native Americans knew the land centuries before white people saw it. The Black Hills were reserved for the Lakota in the Laramie Fortress Treaty of 1868. However, the discovery of gold in the area soon caused American explorers to cross the region, and the government began to force the Sioux to give up their land rights. Progressive groups such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led the war against the occupation, but the land was formally seized by the United States government in 1877. Since then, the Sioux and other Native American activists have been opposed to the U.S. government's claim to sovereignty over their ancestral lands. Native American protests in the 1970s. On August 29, 1970, a group of Native Americans led by the San Francisco-based United Native American Association climbed Mount Rushmore and camped to protest the abandonment of the Fort Laramie Treaty. The following year, on June 6, 1971, a group of Native Americans led by the Indian American Movement captured Mount Rushmore, demanding compliance with the Treaty of 1868. Eventually, 20 Native Americans were arrested and charged with climbing the monument. Marcella Gilbert, a Lakota and Dakota community organizer, recalled watching televised coverage of her mother, AIM leader, Madonna Thunderhawk, occupying Mount Rushmore in 1970. The following year, at age 12, Gilbert participated in the next occupation. She remembers the event as being cool, but also a little tense. Upon a "let's go" order, she ran with others to the top of the site. She recalls that adults taking part in the occupation eventually noticed police and National Park Service rangers gathering below. A decision was made to take the younger members, including Gilbert, back down the mountain before the police arrived. When an adult returned down the mountain with the children, Gilbert recalls watching from hidden locations as federal agents raided their camp. "We were in the trees," says Gilbert. "I remember them tearing through our tents, just like they did at Standing Rock. Taking all the food, breaking into the shed." In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court awarded the Great Sioux Nation $105 million as compensation for their loss of the Black Hills, a sum that was rejected by the Sioux Nation. The tribes instead continued to demand the return of the land, and the rejected money remains in a government bank account. Baker says most park employees are well versed in the traditional story of Mount Rushmore and the U.S. presidents it honors. This history includes how, in 1924, South Dakota state historian Doane Robinson asked sculptor John Gutzon de la Motte Borglum to carve a monument in the Black Hills. Borglum chose to carve George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln into Rushmore Peak. The National Park Service Mount Rushmore website cites Borglum's reason for choosing the men, stating, "They represented the most important events in the history of the United States." Baker says he encouraged his National Park Service staff to expand the story of Mount Rushmore to include the history of American Indians. For example, the Mount Rushmore sculptor allotted the most prominent rock display to the first president of the United States, George Washington. As Dartmouth College professor Colin G. Calloway writes in The Indian World of George Washington, Washington became known as town destroyer among the Iroquois after 1779 when he called for the total destruction and devastation of the American Indian settlements across upstate New York. Borglum chose to depict President Jefferson, a primary author of the Declaration of Independence, for representing the growth of the United States. However, as James Ronda writes in Thomas Jefferson and the Changing West, Jefferson also laid the groundwork for aggressively acquiring Indian land. When Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th president in 1901, he developed a hostile relationship with the American Indians, when he said in a speech in 1886, "I believe in the Indians. I don't believe I'm the only good black man, but I think 9 out of 10 people do that." Borglum chose to honor Lincoln because, as he said, Lincoln represented the preservation of America. While trying to protect the country during the Civil War, Lincoln also signed a warrant to hang 38 Dakota men in Minnesota, the largest mass execution in American history. All these presidents have done good things for the country, Baker said, but added that they also played a role in the U.S. government's suppression of Native American culture.